so much, and I wanted to add my thanks to Arjun and to Dr. Cusick and Dr. Fiala and to the Ethics Center in general for having me. And thank you to everyone who took the time out to come and hear a little bit about my forthcoming book. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the primary points in my book, about my research orientation and my methodology insofar as I have that part worked out, and talk a little bit about my findings too. But I want to tell just one quick story first. Happened a couple hours ago. I was in the philosophy lounge grading, grading, and a student came in and asked me if the plants in the philosophy lounge were real. Now, I didn't know the answer to that question, but then we had a longer conversation in which he wanted to know what I was doing at Fresno and what the topic of my lecture was. And when he heard about the topic of the lecture, he said, oh, okay, so transhumanism makes people's lives better. I don't understand how there could be an ethical question about that. And I thought, that's what's going on. That's why I want to give this lecture. That's such an interesting thing to think. And I think it's really common to think something like, enhancement is about making us better off. If we can make ourselves better off, then why wouldn't we attend to those opportunities? Of course, there are risks, but isn't there a sense in which we must do this kind of work? And that's exactly what kind of got me interested in my research topic in the first place, is the suspicion that there's a lot more going on when we think about human enhancement than just the simple claim that enhancement is always good, full stop. If it's enhancement, it counts as good. For those of you who have been in logic classes, you might recognize that as begging the question, right? In this case, begging the moral question from the beginning. And so that's what I kind of want to talk about tonight. So I wanted to say a little bit about my research in general, and Dr. Fiala already gestured toward this a little bit. I work mainly in applied ethics and bioethics, and typically this is the domain of analytic philosophy, and some of you may be aware of sort of distinctions in the field of philosophy and methodology. Now, I dip my feet in absolutely everything, so I tend to use thinkers like Michel Foucault and Julia Kristeva to attend to questions that come up in bioethics from new angles. So I'm interested in context and relationships. I'm interested in embodiment. I'm interested in how all of these sorts of things impact the choices that we make and the values that we express or don't express in a clinical encounter. So I tend to favor these things and tend to avoid trans-historical or trans-contextual concepts, pure concepts. I avoid analysis of pure concepts and tend to go for context. So that's a note about my research in general. So I focus on the construction of identities, the importance of embodiment and relationships, and the questions that I've attended to have been primarily in bioethics, including emerging technology. So I first got interested about enhancement because I'm really excited about technology in general. I mean, I find it great. I read Wired, I read all of this like geeky magazine stuff online. I always want to know about the newest technology. And so when I started to read in philosophy more specifically on the topic of enhancement, I just thought, great, like let's talk about it. How are we going to make human life better using emerging technologies? What emerging technologies are most exciting? What's going to get us where we want to go? But what I quickly found is that the enhancement discussion was not necessarily what I expected. Where I expected very, very radical sorts of claims and even politics, didn't necessarily end up fulfilling the promise that I thought was possible with regard to technological intervention. So I could talk a little bit more about that. I also wanted to point out my art. I am kind of an art lover, although I don't know as much about art as I would like, and I really love this image that I ran into at the Cleveland Modern Museum of Art. So when I think about enhancement, I think about this sort of leave-taking, this change, this revolution, this revolutionary shift. And I wonder about whether or not technology could potentially get us there. So for those of you who have maybe only read a little bit or who don't know what human enhancement is, I wanted to provide a kind of provisional definition. And the one that I usually work with is this first one, the practice of adding to, protecting, or maximizing capabilities through technological intervention on the body, including the mind, right? So kind of physical intervention, the desire to add to, maximize, or augment capabilities. But what I also found as I was exploring the literature is this notion of radical enhancement, which is typically the idea that we're not going to be recognizably human after these interventions, right? So you get that kind of promise of radicalism, this idea that, yes, there's something big going on here that's going to make us totally different from the way that we began. And I don't know if you've heard this phrase before, post-human. The idea is that radical enhancement would usher in an era of post-humanity. So I'm interested in this sort of thing. But simultaneously, I'm very interested in disability. Now that is partly for personal reasons, partly for activist reasons, partly for philosophical reasons, but I'm really interested in the idea of disability. And what I started to notice is that all of this literature around enhancement tended to actually be talking about disability. Over and over again, assumptions were made that there could be an allyship between enhancement enthusiasts, DIY biohackers in their basements, adding rare earth metals in their fingers. These individuals were saying, look at Amy Mullins, the Paralympic athlete with the 10 pairs of legs. She's me, I'm her. We're in an allyship around the idea of radical technology. There's also discussion all the time about sort of leaving the body behind. Why? Because it's limited, because it doesn't do the things I want it to do. So again, when you think about disability, it's really deeply connected to the idea of enhancement. And I had been independently interested in disability and enhancement, and only realized after exploring sort of the literature around both these things that they were really tied together. And not always, as I will end up concluding, in positive ways. I'm skeptical about the potential for an alliance between transhumanists, who I'll discuss, and disability activists. I think they have different futures in mind, and so I'll try to motivate why I think that. But I should say what my understanding of disability is, and I'll try to be brief. There are a variety of models that try to describe what disability is. For example, the medical model just says, look, disability is a biological matter. It's on the level of the individual. If there's anything to fix about disability, if there are problems related to disability, the person that you should see is a medical professional. That individual will be able to give you knowledge about disability, will be able to potentially find solutions if there are problems around disability. But then the social model, the radical sort of activist style, we need civil rights model, says, no, I think when we talk about disability, we're talking about social failure, institutional failure around inclusion. So really, if there's something to be fixed around disability, if there's something going on with regard to disability, what we need is a ramp. What we need are curb cuts. And yeah, we need those. We definitely need those. We need them. But still, in this story about disability, disability is only present if something has gone wrong. And what I've tried to do in my work on disability is draw out what I call, and others have called, the cultural model of disability, which tries to just find locations of disability, what we call disability discursively, and where we find it in our culture, without necessarily assuming from the beginning that disability is tragic or negative, but seeing where it kind of appears. Sort of in this machine-like way, we have these cultural products and political and social products that kind of determine and hem in what disability is. So I'm thinking about a movie producing an idea of disability that then can create a looping effect as we're watching it, or like a Sheldon Cooper impacting how we understand autism, right? So in these diagnostic criteria that we work with, all of this stuff is a messy, tangled reality. And I don't want to decide from the beginning that something needs fixing. What I really am interested in is just, what do we call disability? And so what I found is that in enhancement literature, we were getting definitions about what disability is. And that part of what was happening in this literature is not just a description of an ideal being to be, but an excluded subject from whom we wanted to distance ourselves that ended up being a sort of disabled subject, I thought. And I wondered about that. So I'm going to make sure that we have enough time for questions at the end. So stop me if I seem like I go too long. But I'm going to do a little bit of motivating about my book before I get to the primary points. So I'm thinking about all of these things, and I want to join the conversation around enhancement. But I have to explain myself about why I think that doing the enhancement conversation as a philosopher should start with disability, that I should use a disability lens, that disability really, really does get us something new about what the enhancement conversation is all about. And so I set up what I hope is a convincing story about this. Essentially that disability is at the center of enhancement proposals. It simply is, in each and every piece that you'll read on enhancement, an implicit, if not explicit, part of the story that they tell about what life should be like. We don't want to have embodiment because it involves limitations. We will choose particular children so that we can become enhanced, meaning that some are not selected, right? So enhancement literature talks about what makes a life of quality, and in doing so, they articulate what doesn't make a life of quality, potentially low levels of cognition or cognitive capability, the inability to sort of have proliferating choices. All of these things sort of come by way of a shadow in the enhancement literature. And then I want to say that enhancement is at the center of bioethics in general. Like, there's a reason I want to talk about human enhancement. There's a reason I want to talk about disability, and then there's a reason I want to talk about human enhancement. Bioethics is constantly wondering about what makes life worth living, about whether or not we need to intervene in particular ways at particular times, about what treatments are justified and how much treatment is justified, and what counts as treatment. So whenever we're looking at bioethics in general, we're constantly wondering about the kinds of questions that enhancement is considering. And at the same time, the questions that enhancement considers sort of focus on or have a result of drawing out images of that disability. So my grand justification for my book is, we gotta look at disability, and enhancement kind of seems to drive bioethics. All of the literature that's out there, though, about enhancement, I don't know if you've noticed this. Some of you have been in a reading group, and some of you have probably done independent reading on some of this, maybe, if you're here. A lot of this literature just feels like it falls short. People are saying things like, well, it should be safe. If we're gonna do enhancement, it better be safe. I'm like, yeah, let's get to the enhancement part. And then they say, okay, if we're gonna do enhancement, we should make sure that everybody can have it, that we should have wide access. And I think, okay, and why? What is this about enhancement that makes it a good project? What should we do here? What are the enhancement technologies or strategies that we're doing? I also worry about the distinctions that are often made. They say things like, oh, okay, so there's a difference between therapy and enhancement. There's a difference between cosmetic and reparative surgery. And I think only if you assume that disability is what you think it is, only if you assume normative sort of species typicality, only if you believe that there is a baseline for humans to exist upon that is more than just a statistical descriptive matter, but actually normatively important, only then do you get distinctions between therapy, enhancement, cosmetic, and reparative surgery. So I think, okay, disability is at the root of this, but nobody's talking about it. So I have to like dig through and think, what can we possibly do to actually tackle the question of enhancement that doesn't just repeat these kind of truisms? Well, wide access, safety, it better actually make people better off. Well, sure, I could say that about getting groceries. I want to know about enhancement. That's what I want to know about. And even when people like, have you heard these words before? Bioconservative, bio-Luddite, bio-libertarian. Okay, so it sounds like, it's kind of like American politics. Sounds like we're at two very different polar opposite ends of an issue. When you say a bioconservative and a bio-libertarian are in a room, you imagine they're kind of desperately at odds with each other. But now hold on a second. If you really examine the literature, what I find is that these individuals who are supposed to be so opposed have a lot in common. They all think, look, authenticity, it's important. We're gonna have to make sure that whatever we do has a level of authenticity. Authenticity is a part of our lives. In other words, they believe in it. Everybody seems to believe in the idea of authenticity. Also on both sides, there's an elevation of technology into a godlike causal role. Everybody seems to be saying things like, well, we can't use technology because it allows us to control things that we shouldn't have control over. And then someone might say, no, that's exactly why we should use technology, because it allows us to have control over things that I think we should have control over. But you notice then that both sides invest this incredible power in technology, that we can actually change the species or something like that. So this is me trying to start to get deeper and deeper as I move down this slide into something that's genuinely about enhancement. Another additional piece is that Leon Kass, very, very stringent bioconservative, and Nick Bostrom, transhumanist, talk about him in a few minutes, both agree that human beings are special. They just disagree about what we're supposed to do about it. So Leon Kass says, we're special, let's not mess with us, right? Let's not change anything, human beings are special. Bostrom says, we're special, that means that we have the chance to control our own evolution. So as I'm looking through all this literature, I'm seeing all this agreement. We have to find a way to crack the code of the enhancement discussion, and I keep thinking that maybe talking about disability will help crack the code. How can I know more about enhancement and have a genuine, strong debate over its merits without cracking that code? I don't think I can. So I do something that became controversial right away, and I've already hinted at it several times. I just pick the strongest proponents of enhancement that I can possibly find, called transhumanists. I say, I have to push. Bostrom might have a lot in common as a transhumanist with bioconservatives like Leon Kass, but he's saying that enhancement is a moral obligation. So if I'm gonna get anywhere with this debate, I've gotta look at these transhumanists. Not just him, but those who agree with him. People who say that this is a moral obligation. I need to know about their strategies. I need to know about their justifications. I need to know about why they think that these things are a moral obligation. That's the only way to kind of get in deeper and sort of engage some of my theoretical lenses on these questions. So I'm thinking about these issues. Transhumanism is just strong advocation of this idea of human enhancement, but it also sets up this notion of posthumanism, this notion that we can and should develop a species that's beyond the human. This can happen, these transhumanists think, through cognitive and physical augmentation of the radical sort that I was referencing earlier. And the sorts of technologies that they're interested in are probably ones that you've thought about or read about, or that Elon Musk has talked about in Wired magazine. So cryogenics, why should we be interested in that? Because hopefully technology will be better later. If we can freeze ourselves, then we'll be better off once we wake up. But in general, right, anti-aging, all of these kinds of technologies, this is just pointed toward one thing for these transhumanists, the possibility that we can stop being human altogether. So they admit that there are possible risks to this enhancement. They know that it deserves exploration and careful consideration. They're not just wanting us to start cutting ourselves open in our basements, again with the basement image. But even so, they still think it's a moral obligation. So again, I think this deserves our attention. But the flack that I've gotten is transhumanists don't always have the best arguments. They're polemic. They do philosophy, but they're fringe figures. Transhumanists do bioethics with an agenda. So why would you deal with arguments that are less good than the arguments that you could find out of more mainstream bioethicists? Well, I hope I've started to motivate why that is, because I don't think that the bioethicists who are working in more mainstream circles have anything interesting to say. Safe, wide access, otherwise don't use it. Got it. And I use, in order to read transhumanism in my book, this is sort of the last, or one of the final preparatory remarks before I get to the stuff that I want to talk about. I use Michel Foucault. And the reason that I do that is threefold, two of which are on this slide. The first is that he has a really cool way of doing history. Instead of looking at the history of a concept and finding how it progresses or develops and telling a story about that concept from an origin point, He's interested in how history can turn quickly from one element to another, jolts and surprises, the idea that our concepts are more the product of accident than a kind of strong and predictable development pattern. So I was interested in using him to look at the history of enhancement technology, and one of the chapters in my book is about 3 moments of enhancement enthusiasm in technology. The first is physical culture. The second is basically hormonal culture, although I don't call it quite that. The development of hormones, synthetic hormones, to try to enhance ourselves. And the third is post-Nazi regime enhancement enthusiasm, where people wanted to say, like Julian Huxley, Aldous Huxley's brother, wanted to say the only thing wrong with eugenics is that it was state-run. So I look at these sort of moments of enhancement thinking using a Foucauldian lens on history to see like where those jolts and surprises are and what that turns out. And I wanted to see what it would reveal. And what I found was that primarily what you get again and again with enhancement, although it has different guises, and maybe this is a development story, I don't know. What you have again and again is a reduction to the body of social and political problems over and over again. People are unhappy, let's use hormones. People are unhappy, physical culture, turn of the century there, Victorian period. Let's sit out in the sun for a little while, take your vitamins. If you don't take your vitamins, you're gonna be worse off. And then with the post-war stuff, the idea that, yeah, indeed, we should be family planning, right? Because we can solve these social and political problems that are larger through that family planning. And then secondly, I use this concept of normalization. So I've tried to use this to develop that idea that I was talking about earlier, and I'll keep going because I think I've already talked about it enough, that because transhumanism posits like a figure, an ideal figure that they want, they also get this shadow figure, somebody that they need to leave behind, and I think that's disability or disabled subjects. So I'm gonna skip forward and I'll talk about biopolitics in a few minutes. I'm gonna skip forward to my first figure that I critique in the book, Nick Bostrom. So could you raise your hand if you've seen his work before? Handful of you, okay. And he is the director of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, and he is famous for a few really interesting things. He says that we're wrong about what we should be concerned about. We're wrong about the kinds of suffering that we should attend to. He says we might be living in a simulation. We heard that argument lately, kind of made the rounds online. We might be living in a simulation. And he wonders about why aren't the aliens paying attention to us? He thinks there are a couple reasons why not. Maybe it might be because we're too boring. It might also be because we're the last ones or we're the first ones. He's written some really interesting things about alien life. But the thing that I find most interesting about Bostrom is exactly how he describes our problems. So he thinks that they're so familiar to us we don't pay attention. The ones about embodiment we might pay attention to. It's like when you stub your toe and you just think, why do I have toes? If I didn't have toes, I wouldn't be able to stub them. He talks about the limits to our bodily functionality. He talks about the limits to our senses, our mood, our energy, our self-control. Again, I think about this self-control thing pretty often, and I'm willing to bet that you do too. Acrasia, Aristotle, right? We want something and we know we should have it, but then we just can't make it happen. And he thinks, that's too bad. Why don't we try to fix that? Our opportunity range, he wants us to have more choices. Our lifespan, he thinks death is a dragon that should be slayed. He doesn't understand why we're not more upset about it. He says we cart our loved ones off to the dragon every day, and we just wait for its next victim. What's wrong with us? He's also worried about limits to our cognition. He notes, we can't read every single book in the Library of Congress. There might be a lot of things that are true that we don't know about. That's a problem. He connects the limitations with regard to our minds to lifespan as well. He says every time somebody dies, we lose the equivalent of one book, the knowledge that they could have shared. And he doesn't want that to happen anymore. Every year, he says we lose the Library of Alexandria, or more than every year, I think, more often than that. So these are the kinds of things that he's worried about. And he thinks, I know how to fix it. We've got to get rid of this body thing. Forget it. What good does it do us? I can die that way. I can get injured. I only have so many choices. If I want to reach the high shelf, wearing my heels so you can't tell, augmentation. If I want to reach the high shelf, I can't. Not without a ladder. What's up with that? I don't want to have to deal with that anymore. So he thinks that we should try to transcend embodiment. How? Mind uploading strategies, maybe? He's a little light on the details with regard to how that would work. He tries to say, look, if consciousness arises from the material matter that is our brain, then maybe we could make some other kind of material carry that consciousness. I don't think that's too silly. I think, we should think about that really seriously. So he says, let's overcome the body's fragility and save our intellects from our bodies. Let's just do that by escaping them altogether. He also describes the body as a self-combusting paper hut. I remember once I paraphrased this as flammable, but that doesn't capture it at all. It's not that the paper hut is flammable, it's that you know it's going to burn down. And he doesn't understand why we're complacent about that. So here are my concerns. Bostrom relies on and revives a strict division between the mind and the body. I can remove my mind from my body. That's interesting, because I thought that our embodiment was deeply connected to the mind, right? Philosophers like Spinoza from the medieval period said things like, oh, we just are sort of embodied minds, right? You can't get around that kind of body-mind connection. I also worry that he presumes that more is always better. Do I really want more choices? This is where some of you might strongly disagree with me. I actually don't think that choices are better if there are more of them. I don't. I think that meaning takes off from the ground if we have fewer choices. So I could try to justify this in a variety of ways. I could reference Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom. I could reference the smorgasbord effect, where you're more unhappy with the more choices that you have. Longer menu at a restaurant, scientists say that we hate the food. Short menu, we think it's delicious. Why? I don't know. So I could go with this philosophically or scientifically, but I'm not so sure that more is always better. I'm not sure about that with regard to cognitive capability. I'm not sure about that with regard to number of years alive. I'm not sure about that with regard to choices. And finally, I think that his perspective devalues persons with disabilities. I think it especially devalues those with cognitive disability. Everything that he professes to hate about the body is precisely what disabled activists have been trying to say are not disqualifying issues, as in disqualifying from having a life worth living, right? So the fact of limitation itself. But also with this cognitive stuff, if you say that it is a shame that our IQ is not higher, the presumption is that our quality of life is tied to our cognitive capability. And I'm not so sure that that's true. I'm happy to entertain your thoughts on that during the Q&A. The second figure that I work on in the book is Julian Savulescu. And he also directs an ethics center at Oxford, the Uhiro Center for Practical Ethics. And he works on similar issues to Bostrom. They've published together, they've worked together, they collaborate a bit, although I'm not sure they do so anymore. They did more so in the past. But Savulescu is extremely prolific. He's written on a load of issues, and he writes basically very provocative stuff. He is someone who is like, okay, if you're worried about keeping people on life support because they might become organ donors, I'm going to defend the ethics of using someone as an organ donor based on that, right? So let's clone people because they can become potential harvests for organ donation, not in spite of the fact that they might become somebody that we can harvest an organ from. So he's a provocateur. But the thing that I worry about with him is precisely the idea that we might not be fit for our own future. He thinks that if we continue the way that we are now, that we face existential risk, that we might very well die off as a species. And we would then be responsible for that because we didn't take steps to make ourselves fit for the future. What might those steps be? Moral enhancement. What's the real problem here? Collective action problems. War, climate change, tribalism of all kinds, all of these sorts of things. He just thinks, well, we're too dedicated to our nearest and dearest. We have this sort of parochial, kin-based ethics, and I don't like that. Why not use moral enhancement so that we feel more connected with people across the world? Then maybe we can overcome some of these collective action problems. So when he's talking about moral enhancement, he's not talking about reading Aristotle. He actually means that we should have a peptide inhaler, oxytocin, that increases our bonding chemicals so that when we look at a photo of somebody that we previously might have wanted to throw a bomb at, that now we actually want to invite them over for dinner or something like that. So he believes that we must enhance. Moral obligation, yeah, because we're going to be extinct as a species otherwise. It's kind of funny to call that like a moral obligation. It's not so much saying, he's not so much saying, look, this is a moral obligation in the traditional sense, take it or leave it. He's saying, you can't leave it. You've got to do something. Our traditional methods of moral enhancement, like studying philosophy, are never going to do it on their own. Studying philosophy, who needs it? So the thing that I go for in my book is the strategy. So again, I look at all this stuff, I look at the literature, and people are making these suggestions, and then somebody says, as long as it's safe and widely accessible. And I think, wait, let's look at the strategy more closely. So again, moral enhancement, okay, how? Not just the peptide inhalers. He primarily thinks that we can enhance by way of negative genetic selection. That is, via his principle of procreative beneficence. That we actually should, insofar as possible, produce the best children of all options. So what he believes here is that we have a moral obligation to select for the traits that will contribute to the best chances for the best life. Why am I rendering it like that? Because he's not talking about education. He's not talking about how to make the child that you have better off. He's talking about how to have the best child of all the possible options. That's very different from treating a particular child that already exists in such a way that they'll be better off down the line. So how would you do that? You would use a combination of prenatal diagnosis and selective abortion, or you might use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and then in vitro fertilization so that you don't actually have to engage in the selective abortion procedure. He believes that the second option is better just because, he's a utilitarian, he thinks just because it has less psychological burden on the reproducers. So he wants us to engage in procreative beneficence, and he wants us to do it using the available scientific means. But we also have a sort of technological imperative that when new technology comes online, that we need to use that to have the best possible child of all our possible children. Now, I should say that because he is a utilitarian, the way that he talks about morality is pretty different than the way most of us talk about morality. He says that doing the thing that's right, well, he says basically that we should do what we have the most reason to do, or the best reason to do. So at one point he renders this responsibility the same as not having a responsibility not to smoke. So it's a little bit less strong than you might imagine that it is, but it does hold for most situations. He thinks that we should do this. So I have a sort of multi-pronged critique here. A primary one that I'm not going to talk about is, who has the money for this? Takes a lot of resources to engage in procreative beneficence, and I'm not so sure that that works out to having better lives for our future children. But my concerns that I'm going to talk about now is that I think that he's reducing morality to a matter of the body. And this is connected completely with the history of enhancement thinking, when you do a kind of genealogy of what enhancement thinking has been about for the last 100 years. Why should I think that it will make our children better off to engage in technological and bodily intervention rather than political and social collaboration? I also think, and I've gotten feedback this isn't quite fair since he is talking about genetics, but I also think that there's a bit of genetic determinism here, an over-reliance on genetic factors. How do I know that the embryo that I select will be the one that has the best life? Based on a genetic marker? That doesn't predict the way we think it does how well someone will do later. Troubling is that there are lots of other things that predict how well people do, including social prejudice. So is it the case that procreative beneficence says that we should make sure that we have white male children? He tries to deal with that critique, I don't think very elegantly. He says, well, we shouldn't do social and political things from the clinic. We shouldn't solve social and political problems from the clinic. And I think that's exactly what you're doing. So I worry. And the final piece I'll just talk about because it links with the other things that I'll say near the end. Procreative beneficence is funny because nobody actually gets enhanced. This is an enhancement. Because you're selecting a person that wouldn't have existed otherwise, there's nobody that gets enhanced. What does happen, though, is that we mark off particular fetuses as impaired or particular embryos as marked for not choosing to come into existence. So we've said no to particular modes of life, or what we believe represent particular modes of life through genetic markers. But we haven't actually enhanced anyone in particular. Some of you might be familiar with Parfit's non-identity problem. The point is these people wouldn't have existed otherwise before selecting them. So we haven't enhanced anyone. It's a weird sort of enhancement on the level of the population. Enhances nobody in particular, but we do mark off particular potential people as unworthy of life. And finally, I worry that he links disability so tightly with risk. And again, I'm interested in the cultural model of disability, so I just noticed this. We're producing the idea of disability as risk. If you're in a clinical encounter and you're potentially going to reproduce, and you talk with your physician about your pregnancy, disability and risk will be in the same sentence. Disability and risk will be interchangeable. So that means that now you've encountered the idea of disability merely as risk to your fetus or risk to yourself, and you haven't actually encountered any person with a disability to countervail that kind of description of what disability is. So I use this final concept from Foucault to talk about what I think is going on here with transhumanism, with their actual strategies. Again, I just want to dig down deep to talk about what enhancement strategies are being suggested. I believe that enhancement discussion that we have right now from its strongest proponents makes positive eugenics and negative eugenics the same thing. That it conflates choosing what sort of people there should be with making better people. That the idea of enhancement itself in this literature requires the elimination of particular potential modes of life. Elimination is a weird word here. The disallowing of particular modes of life. So how do I become enhanced? By deselecting. How do I become enhanced? By rejecting the body. All of which has material implications for already existing people. And I'm not talking about the fetus or embryo. I'm not using that already existing to refer to that. I'm talking about people that could be in this room, right? That there are already existing people who are under this description of having a disabled life and that these discussions impact them negatively. So the rejection of disabled forms of life is posed as necessary for the realization of enhancement. And Foucault talks about this sort of thing under the concept of the biopolitical, under the idea of a kind of power that makes particular people live while sort of disallowing other people. And Foucault thinks that at the heart of biopolitics, and the Nazi regime is a major example for him, is racism. And I read that, and I read the way he's describing how the health of the population is posed against the potential problems that a person of color would produce in that context. And I just think this is very good for understanding how disability is operating in enhancement. They're saying we're all going to be better off if only nobody had bodies and limitations, if only we weren't subject to any risk, and if only we don't bring about people who are going to have these negative traits. So those are the sorts of things that I'm concerned about. And I want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions, so I'll just go straight to my primary conclusions. I think that transhumanist thinking is far less radical than it purports to be. I think that with regard to transhumanism, what we actually see is a kind of extension of humanism itself. They don't want a post-human, radically different being. They want a maximized human, somebody who has all the sorts of things that we appreciate about being human, but to the nth, maximized. And so I think, oh, I was looking for radical politics and radical cool things, and then I got humanism. I got the Enlightenment on acid. I also, and I can spend more time on this, and obviously I do also want you to buy my book, or at least look at it in the library. So I did kind of try to motivate this a little bit, but I believe that transhumanism depends on this kind of illicit biopolitical logic that depends on devaluing particular forms of life. And I think that we could easily talk about radical enhancement, but I want to change the game. I want to talk about social and political collaboration as a mode of enhancement. I think that we can easily talk about enhancing our lives, and there's so many ways to do it, and I don't think an inhaler, a peptide inhaler, is the way to go. Do I think that medicine and technology are inappropriate to these questions? No, not at all. I just don't think that they're the primary mode of intervention. I also think, and this is the stretchy piece that I really have been working on for a long time, and feminist philosophers in general have worked on, that having a body, that having fragile embodiment, being vulnerable to injury, is a starting point for ethics. It doesn't stop us from being ethical. And this is a thread that I try to pursue throughout my book. We're so entranced by eliminating risk and expanding choice and making sure that we're not vulnerable to any sort of risk based on our embodiment or injury based on our embodiment. We're so entranced by that, but that's not really what makes human life good. And so I'd love to talk more about any of these things. I'll just say thank you. And my book explores these items in more detail. So thank you very much.